There's specific category of damage that only people you've granted access can inflict. Strangers can inconvenience you, frustrate you, even threaten you. But they can't truly betray you because betrayal requires trust, and trust requires relationship. The harm that fundamentally alters how you view people comes from those you allowed into your life, based on assessments that proved inaccurate. Most people respond to this painful recognition by either becoming cynical, trusting no one, viewing all relationships as potential betrayal, or by continuing to make similar assessment errors, granting access based on the same faulty criteria that failed previously. Neither response is optimal. Cynicism limits your capacity to form valuable relationships. Continuing with faulty assessment methods guarantees repetition of painful outcomes. The strategic approach is different. Develop better assessment systems so you can distinguish between people who've earned trust and those who haven't. Niccolò Machiavelli operated in an environment where assessment errors were often fatal. The advisor who seemed loyal but betrayed when interests aligned differently. The ally who promised support but withdrew when circumstances changed. The friend who appeared trustworthy but proved otherwise when tested. His solution wasn't trusting no one. That would have made leadership impossible. It was developing assessment systems based on observed behavioral patterns, rather than on verbal assurances or projected assumptions about human nature. Trust based on demonstrated behavior rather than claimed character. This behavioral assessment approach remains relevant, not because modern environments are as dangerous as Renaissance Italian politics, but because the basic patterns persist. People who prove untrustworthy typically display specific behavioral indicators before the actual betrayal. The problem isn't lack of information. It's failure to recognize what available information signals. What follows are 3 behavioral patterns that consistently predict relationship problems. Not personality traits or character judgments, but specific observable behaviors that indicate someone hasn't earned the trust level you might be considering granting them. These aren't subtle psychological tells requiring expert interpretation. They're clear patterns visible to anyone paying attention. The challenge isn't recognition complexity. It's overcoming the motivated reasoning that makes you ignore clear signals because you want to believe someone is trustworthy. Type this in the comments. I assess behavior, not intentions. Trust develops gradually through reciprocal disclosure and demonstrated reliability over time. Each party shares something, observes how the other handles it, then decides whether to share more. This gradual process allows assessment of whether the other person handles disclosed information appropriately. Some people bypass this gradual process by sharing highly personal information very early in relationship. Childhood trauma, significant secrets, vulnerable confessions, before normal relationship development would justify that disclosure level. This creates specific problem. When someone shares deep vulnerability immediately, social pressure for reciprocal disclosure is strong. You feel obligated to match their openness. But you've had no opportunity to assess whether they handle sensitive information appropriately because the relationship is too new. The result? You're sharing information at level that isn't justified by demonstrated trustworthiness. You're granting access based on social obligation created by their premature disclosure rather than based on proven reliability. Why do people engage in premature disclosure? Sometimes it's poor boundary management. They share everything with everyone regardless of relationship depth. Sometimes it's strategic. They're creating obligation for reciprocal disclosure to gain information they wouldn't access otherwise. Either way, it's warning indicator. If they share inappropriately early with you, they probably share inappropriately with others, which means information you share with them isn't secure. If they're strategically creating obligation, they're manipulating rather than building genuine relationship. Machiavelli would recognize this as basic strategic error on their part that provides information about them. They've revealed either poor judgment about appropriate disclosure timing or manipulative intent to create obligation. Both indicate they haven't earned trust level their disclosure seems to request. The appropriate response isn't matching their disclosure level. It's maintaining appropriate disclosure for actual relationship stage, while noting their premature disclosure as assessment information. You can be warm and engaged while being strategic about what you share. In professional context, this might be colleagues sharing extensive personal problems very early in working relationship. In personal context, this might be new romantic interest sharing deep trauma on first few dates. In both cases, inappropriate disclosure timing for relationship stage. The person with healthy boundaries shares gradually, matching disclosure level to relationship development. The person with poor boundaries or manipulative intent shares dramatically early, creating pressure for reciprocal disclosure before trust is earned. Strategic assessment means recognizing premature disclosure as warning indicator rather than as sign of special connection. It indicates they don't have appropriate judgment about disclosure timing, or they're using disclosure strategically to create obligation. Clear position taking involves social risk. When you publicly support someone or something, you're creating accountability. If that support later proves misguided, you bear some reputational cost. If the supported person faces opposition, you're associated with them. Some people consistently avoid this risk by maintaining ambiguity about their positions. They won't clearly support or oppose. They see both sides. They understand everyone's perspective. They don't want to get involved. This seems mature and balanced until you need their support. The pattern becomes visible during conflicts or decisions requiring clear positions. When you're in dispute with someone and mutual acquaintance is asked where they stand, they refuse to commit. I'm friends with both of you. I don't want to take sides. Both of you have valid points. This ambiguity maintenance is strategic on their part. By refusing to commit, they preserve relationships with both parties regardless of outcome. If you win, they can claim they supported you privately. If you lose, they avoid association with your loss. Machiavelli was explicit about this. Strategic ambiguity during conflicts indicates someone who values their optionality more than your relationship. When tested, they won't support you because support creates accountability they're unwilling to accept. This pattern manifests in smaller ways before major conflicts. Group decisions where they won't state preference. Social situations where they won't commit to plans. Professional contexts where they won't support proposals publicly. Each instance is low stakes individually but reveals pattern. They avoid accountability by refusing clear positions. When high-stakes situation emerges requiring their support, this pattern predicts they'll maintain their ambiguity rather than supporting you. The appropriate response is calibrating your trust level to match their demonstrated unwillingness to commit. They can be pleasant acquaintances, but they haven't earned deep trust because they've shown they won't support you when support involves social risk. Strategic assessment means recognizing that consistent ambiguity maintenance isn't diplomatic neutrality. It's unwillingness to accept accountability that comes with clear position taking. People who won't take clear positions in low-stakes situations won't support you in high-stakes ones. The reliable person takes clear positions. Understanding this creates accountability. They might be wrong sometimes, but at least they commit rather than maintaining strategic ambiguity that preserves their optionality at your expense. Genuine pro-social behavior focuses on actual impact rather than on being seen doing good things. The person who helps because they value helping focuses on whether their help actually helps. The person who helps because they value being seen as helpful focuses on whether others recognize their helping. This creates observable difference. Impact-focused helpers are relatively quiet about their helping. They don't need recognition because the satisfaction comes from actual impact. Performance-focused helpers publicize their helping because recognition is the actual motivation. The pattern: someone who consistently publicizes their virtuous actions more than is necessary for the action itself. Every charitable act becomes social media post. Every good deed becomes story they retell multiple times. Every helpful act gets mentioned prominently in conversations. This excessive publicizing signals that recognition, not impact, is primary motivation. They're not doing good things because they value good outcomes. They're doing visible good things because they value being perceived as good person. Why does this predict relationship problems? Because when relationships aren't public or when their actions toward you won't generate recognition, their motivation disappears. They'll help you publicly where it demonstrates their virtue. They won't help you privately where no one sees. Machiavelli would recognize this as fundamental unreliability. The person whose virtuous behavior is recognition-driven will only behave virtuously when recognition is available. In private interactions where virtue won't be publicly recognized, they lack motivation to maintain virtuous behavior. This manifests in specific ways. They're helpful in group settings where others see. They're less helpful in private interactions. They'll support you publicly if it makes them look good. They won't support you privately if there's no audience. The pattern becomes particularly visible when you ask them for help that won't generate recognition. Notice whether they're equally helpful in private as in public. If helpfulness decreases significantly without audience, you've confirmed the pattern. Strategic assessment means recognizing performative virtue as indicating their behavior is recognition-driven rather than value-driven. They can be reliable in public contexts where they gain recognition. They're unreliable in private contexts where no one's watching. The genuinely virtuous person maintains similar behavior publicly and privately because their motivation is internal values rather than external recognition. Consistency across contexts indicates genuine virtue. Performance that requires audience indicates recognition seeking. Recognizing these patterns requires systematic observation rather than relying on impressions or feelings about people. Most people assess trustworthiness based on how someone makes them feel rather than on what behavioral patterns they demonstrate. This feeling-based assessment is exactly what these patterns exploit. Premature disclosure makes you feel specially trusted. Committed ambiguity seems diplomatic and mature. Performative virtue appears genuinely good. Each pattern creates positive feelings that discourage objective assessment. Strategic assessment requires separating feelings from pattern recognition. Someone might make you feel good while demonstrating concerning patterns. Your warm feelings don't override the behavioral evidence. Machiavelli emphasized this repeatedly. Assess based on observed behavior rather than claimed character or feelings generated. The advisor who made the prince feel understood while demonstrating unreliable patterns was still unreliable, regardless of generated feelings. The methodology. Observe behavior across multiple contexts over time. Don't make permanent trust assessments based on single interactions. Watch for patterns that repeat consistently. For premature disclosure, do they share inappropriately personal information very early with multiple people, or was your interaction unique? If they do it generally, it's pattern indicating poor boundaries or manipulative intent. For committed ambiguity, do they consistently avoid clear positions across various situations, or do they sometimes commit clearly? If ambiguity is consistent pattern, it indicates they won't support you when support involves accountability. For performative virtue, is their helpfulness consistent in public and private contexts, or does it require audience? If they're significantly more helpful when others are watching, it indicates recognition seeking rather than genuine virtue. This observation period feels inefficient. You want to know quickly whether someone is trustworthy, but premature trust assessments based on inadequate observation often lead to painful corrections later. Better to assess carefully initially than to grant trust prematurely and retract it painfully. The timeline varies based on relationship type and interaction frequency. Professional relationships might require months of observation. Personal relationships might require longer because patterns are less visible in lower frequency interaction. The key is not rushing to permanent trust assessments before you've observed sufficient behavioral evidence. Maintain provisional assessment that can adjust based on accumulated evidence rather than making permanent assessment based on early impressions. Strategic operators become comfortable with this provisional assessment period. They engage warmly while withholding complete trust until behavioral patterns justify it. They don't need to immediately categorize someone as completely trustworthy or completely untrustworthy. Sometimes patterns aren't clearly visible through passive observation. Strategic assessment includes active testing. creating situations that reveal how someone responds under conditions that would expose concerning patterns. These aren't elaborate manipulations. They're simple situations that test whether someone's behavior matches their presentation. Each pattern has characteristic response when tested appropriately. For premature disclosure pattern, establish boundary around what you're willing to discuss. I'm not comfortable sharing that yet. Healthy response, respect for boundary. Concerning response, pressure to override boundary, guilt about maintaining it, withdrawal to punish boundary establishment. This test reveals whether they respect boundaries or whether they expect access based on their premature disclosure. Healthy people respect reasonable boundaries. Manipulative people respond to boundaries as rejection. For committed ambiguity pattern, create situation requiring clear position. We need to decide this. Which option do you support? Hold space until they commit. Healthy response, stated preference with reasoning. Concerning response, continued equivocation, deflection, attempts to avoid committing. This test reveals whether they can take clear positions when required, or whether they'll maintain ambiguity regardless of relationship needs. Reliable people can commit when necessary, even if they prefer avoiding conflicts generally. For performative virtue pattern, request help that won't generate recognition, private assistance that no one else will know about. Observe whether helpfulness level matches public helpfulness. Healthy response, similar helpfulness publicly and privately. Concerning response, significantly reduced helpfulness without audience. This test reveals whether helpfulness is value-driven or recognition-driven. Genuine virtue maintains across contexts. Performance requires audience. The key is making tests reasonable and proportionate. You're not creating dramatic situations. You're creating normal relationship situations that happen to reveal useful information about behavioral patterns. Most importantly, believe the results. If someone fails tests by demonstrating concerning patterns, don't rationalize or make excuses. They've revealed how they operate. That information should inform your trust calibration. Machiavelli emphasized learning from behavioral evidence rather than maintaining beliefs, despite contradicting evidence. When someone shows you who they are through behavioral responses, believe the behavior rather than your preferences about who you'd like them to be. Strategic assessment means testing appropriately and believing results rather than ignoring evidence that contradicts your hopes. Once you've identified concerning patterns, appropriate response is calibrated adjustment rather than dramatic confrontation. You don't need to expose them, denounce them, or create conflict. You adjust your trust level to match what their patterns justify. For premature disclosure pattern, maintain warm engagement while being strategic about what you share. You can be friendly without matching their inappropriate disclosure level. They revealed poor boundaries or manipulative intent. Respond by maintaining appropriate boundaries yourself. For committed ambiguity pattern, recalibrate expectations for support. They've shown they won't take clear positions supporting you. Accept this reality and don't rely on their support in situations requiring commitment. They can remain acquaintances, but they haven't earned trust level that assumes support. For performative virtue pattern, reduce expectations for private support. They've shown helpfulness is recognition-driven. In public contexts, they might be helpful. In private contexts, assume they won't be. Calibrate expectations accordingly. The common element, you adjust your behavior and expectations based on observed patterns without needing to confront or change them. They are who they've shown themselves to be. You simply respond strategically to that reality. Machiavelli advised against useless confrontations. Confronting someone about patterns they've demonstrated often just creates conflict without changing the underlying patterns. More effective approach, adjust your trust level and behavior based on what patterns indicate. This might mean gradual reduction in relationship depth. You see them less frequently. You share less personally. You don't rely on them for support. They might notice this withdrawal, or they might not. Either way, you're protecting yourself by calibrating trust to what they've demonstrated they've earned. The advantage of gradual withdrawal, it avoids dramatic conflict while accomplishing protective objective. You're not creating scenes or burning bridges. You're simply becoming less available and less sharing as trust recalibrates to appropriate level. Some relationships end through this process. As you withdraw to appropriate trust level, interaction decreases until relationship essentially ends. That's acceptable outcome when patterns indicate they haven't earned deeper trust. Other relationships stabilize at appropriate depth. They remain acquaintances or limited context friends at trust level matching what they've demonstrated they deserve. That's also acceptable outcome. Strategic response means matching your trust investment to demonstrated trustworthiness, rather than to your hopes about the relationship or to their expectations about access they think they deserve. Before judging others' patterns, examine whether you demonstrate concerning patterns yourself. Self-assessment prevents hypocrisy and improves your own reliability as relationship partner. Do you share prematurely? Review your disclosure patterns. Do you share highly personal information very early in new relationships? If so, you're creating the same concerns in others that premature disclosure creates in you. Develop better boundaries around disclosure timing. Do you maintain committed ambiguity? Review situations where clear positions were needed. Did you take clear stances supporting people who'd earned your support? Or did you maintain strategic ambiguity preserving your optionality? If latter, you're demonstrating unreliability you'd recognize as concerning in others. Do you perform virtue? Review your prosocial behavior. Are you equally helpful publicly and privately? Or do you help primarily when others will recognize your helpfulness? If your virtue requires audience, you're recognition-seeking rather than genuinely virtuous. Machiavelli emphasized that effective leadership required self-examination. The prince who demanded loyalty while being disloyal himself created unstable alliances. The advisor who expected trustworthiness while being untrustworthy himself had no moral authority. Applied personally, you can't reasonably expect patterns from others that you don't demonstrate yourself. If you want clear support, you need to provide clear support. If you want appropriate boundaries, you need to maintain appropriate boundaries. If you want genuine virtue, you need to practice genuine virtue. This self-assessment isn't about achieving perfection. It's about identifying patterns you demonstrate that you'd recognize as concerning in others, then working to improve those patterns. The standard is consistency between what you expect from others and what you demonstrate yourself. If you wouldn't trust someone who demonstrated patterns you demonstrate, you need to improve your own patterns before judging others for similar ones. This self-work typically reveals that improving your own reliability makes you better at recognizing reliability in others. As you develop clearer boundaries, you notice boundary issues more readily. As you practice taking clear positions, you recognize ambiguity maintenance more easily. As your virtue becomes less performative, you spot performance more quickly. Strategic operators maintain consistency between their assessment standards for others and their behavioral standards for themselves. This prevents hypocrisy while improving both assessment accuracy and personal reliability. The pattern is clear. Certain behavioral patterns consistently predict relationship problems. Premature disclosure indicates poor boundaries or manipulative intent. Committed ambiguity indicates unwillingness to support when support involves accountability. Performative virtue indicates recognition seeking rather than genuine values. These patterns are observable through systematic attention to behavior across contexts over time. They're testable through situations that reveal characteristic responses. They're manageable through calibrated trust adjustment rather than dramatic confrontation. Machiavelli operated in an environment where assessment errors often proved fatal. Trusting the wrong advisor, forming the wrong alliance, or granting access to the wrong person could destroy position, resources, or life. His solution was systematic behavioral assessment rather than trust based on feelings or projected assumptions. Modern environments typically have lower stakes, but basic principle remains. Trust should be based on demonstrated behavior rather than on claims, feelings, or assumptions. The person who demonstrates concerning patterns hasn't earned trust level you might be considering granting them. The practical path is developing systematic observation habits. Notice behavioral patterns. Test when appropriate. Adjust trust level based on what patterns indicate, rather than on what you hope or prefer. This requires overcoming motivated reasoning that makes you ignore clear signals because you want to believe someone is trustworthy. The feelings someone generates don't override behavioral evidence they demonstrate. Most people resist systematic assessment because it feels calculating or cynical. But strategic assessment isn't cynicism, it's appropriate diligence. You're not assuming everyone is untrustworthy. You're assessing who's demonstrated trustworthiness versus who hasn't. The alternative is granting trust prematurely based on feelings or assumptions, then experiencing painful corrections when behavioral patterns you ignored earlier prove significant. Strategic assessment prevents these painful corrections by calibrating trust appropriately from the start. Type this commitment. I calibrate trust to demonstrated behavior. If this framework provided value, engage and share. Most people assess trustworthiness based on feelings rather than developing systematic behavioral observation. Real protection comes from accurate assessment, recognizing patterns that predict problems before granting trust to people who haven't demonstrated they deserve it, through consistent, reliable behavior across contexts and time.